Hello, Mr. Dwyer here. Hello, guys, to all my students in third and fifth period AP US history. Um, this is strange for me. Um, in the early part of my career, my first year as a student teacher, I was teaching during 9/11, and that was, of course, back in Dublin. And now, 18 years later, here I am. Um, Teaching during the coronavirus crisis, and I have never had to record myself teaching before or record a lecture. So you'll forgive me if this is a bit stilted at times, if it's unnatural. As you know, I like to lecture um, in an interactive way. I ask you guys questions, you turn to your neighbors, discuss things. There's eye contact, there is a sense of interaction between us. This is a little bit unnatural for me, so forgive me. I will do my best. I do, however, fully expect you all to watch these lectures and to respond with the to this corresponding chat rooms in our Google Classroom. I will outline there in more full detail what I expect. So for here, I'm just going to get on with the lecturing. So yes, let's go with that, and you guys can take notes with pen and paper or typing as you're listening to these and interacting with the slides, or however you so wish. Okay, let's start. So, FDR and the New Deal. Now, because uh, we anticipated on the Friday morning that school would be cancelled, I did go in and get ahead a little bit more lecture in with fifth period. So fifth period, you may have covered some of this, about five or six slides perhaps, but I'm going to record that again for your benefit, but also, of course, for third period. So FDR and the New Deal is our title. Now, bear in mind that we are looking at 4 possible DBQ prompts for the next test. And as you know, that was also supposed to be accompanied by a multiple choice test. I'm not so sure about that now, given that school is to be suspended till mid-April, but we will definitely be going ahead with the test by DBQ of this unit. We'll do it remotely. If you have access to notes and so forth, so be it. But we will have a written DBQ assignment. So here are the 4 possible prompts that you're going to get. 1, what were the most critical causes of the Great Depression? As you know, we've already went over these. We discussed them at length in class, looked at videos and so forth, and graphs and maps and pictures. And then you gave your opinions in the SurveyMonkey form, and that was interesting. And then we have 2 possible prompts related to the New Deal, the Great Depression. Number 2, analyze the general approach and responses of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to the problems of the Great Depression. How effective were these responses? When considering this question, one can consider many things, not just lowering of unemployment, how successful was that, but how effective was the administration in stimulating the recovery of the private sector and in reaching out to all groups in society. 3, to what extent did the FDR administration change the relationship between the federal government and the American people? I hope that you all got a chance to watch that documentary on the Roosevelts, which was available to Ridgeflix. Unfortunately, you cannot watch that off of school property, off of PSD property. And then there's number 4. To what extent did World War II transform the economy and society of the United States? Now, that's something we won't discuss it now. When the World War II unit, I'll return to this topic as well. Okay, so let's get into the New Deal then. So things to consider before we start. The New Deal, like the Great Depression, was designed to tackle is enormous. It is the largest legislative program in American history. So with that in mind, you should just try to keep the big picture. and the two possible DBQ prompts in mind. Note that I'm less concerned with detail. For example, I won't be asking you to separate acts into the first and second New Deal. I won't expect you to have a chronological understanding of this. And of course, I won't be trying to catch you out so that you know your acronyms, your alphabet soup, your FERA from your PWA, etc. That's not super important. We want to understand this, the larger impact of this program. So, the 1932 election, we'll see here by the map, the immediate takeaway is that Herbert Hoover and the Republicans are hammered in the election, and it is a triumph for FDR and the Democrats. However, worth noting here is the discrepancy between the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. Hoover still is able to retain 40% of the vote, once again showing us two things. One, how huge numbers of people are absolutely wedded to their party of choice and will not be moved from that choice, regardless of how poorly the government has performed. And secondly, it also reminds us of how cruel the Electoral College system is. Here we have Hoover only garnering 11% of the Electoral College, whilst actually gaining 40% of the popular vote. Right. Now, so big picture, what were FDR's main goals in the early years? And so what we have here is a pragmatist trying to react to a time of huge crisis. And of course, again, you are now sitting at home, hopefully watching this, listening to this lecture, taking notes, and it cannot be lost upon you that we're discussing this during the coronavirus crisis, which is also a crisis of epic proportions. So we are able to make a connection here to this. Of course, the difference being that in our time, we have great expectations of federal government. Those expectations were set for us by FDR, who is the most pivotal president in the 20th century. So what were his main goals in the early years? Well, his main goals were to tackle the unemployment crisis. The graph that I previously showed you, you will see that it's spiraled downwards or upwards, if you want to look at it in that regard, to 25% of the working population. So you see here in the picture on the left, people wanted work, desperately wanted a job, any job. And so one of FDR's main goals was to provide employment in any way the administration could. Of course, traditionally, this had never been the duty of a government. It was the duty of the private sector. It had nothing to do with the government in history. Even FDR's distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, did not take on the responsibility for employment of people. So this is going to be something entirely new. A second great goal is to provide relief. There's one thing to kickstart the economy and to get people a recovery in the long term, but as Harry Hopkins, FDR's one of his top officials said, people don't eat in the long term, people eat in the short term. So providing relief is also a very important task. And finally, we have the graph on the right here. You will look and see, of course, the complete lack of faith in the financial sector, the collapse of banks. And so to revive faith in capitalism and to save capitalism was one of FDR's primary goals, and to get the banking system working again for the American people. Okay. Now, so what radical role did FDR envision for the federal government in the recovery? And why did he believe this was necessary? Well, first off, we should say that FDR was not a great intellectual. Certainly one of my favorite presidents, and that's not going to be lost on any of you. Probably my favorite. But he was not a great intellectual. He was a smart guy, well-read, but not a Thomas Jefferson, not even a Teddy Roosevelt. He was a pragmatic guy. He was somebody who was prepared to try things, and he was a confident individual who basically was prepared to use any means necessary to revive the American economy. And so desperate times called for new innovations. And in this, he believed that the federal government, for the first time in American history, should and could play a part in kickstarting the economy. Because quite simply, the private sector had failed. Um, Herbert Hoover's volunteerism had not worked. Rugged individualism, pulling oneself up by their bootstraps, this had also clearly failed. And therefore, there was a need for something new. Now, in doing this, he was guided somewhat by a British economist, John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics. So FDR was a pragmatist, however, his interventionist approach was close to the philosophy of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that when economies suffer a downturn, governments should borrow and spend money to boost economic activity. When growth returns, part of the proceeds should then be used to repay the debt. Now, of course, the critics of Keynesian economics will point out that it can lead to spiraling debt. However, this only occurs when governments fail to fulfill the second part, that is to pay down the proceeds when growth returns. So, for example, in recent years, it is fair to say that whilst unemployment was low, that the current administration did not take the opportunity to pay down the debt, and therefore this does lead, unfortunately, to accumulating debt. But it can work, it has worked, and it worked in the time of FDR. Now, one of the questions that people ask about the New Deal is that, considering this is a huge expansion of government, why didn't the New Deal significantly increase the national debt? Well, one of the answers to this is that tax revenues rose as employment rates slowly recovered. So therefore, as people are working, provided with jobs, they pay taxes. Those taxes can go towards the federal exchequer and up the situation. Secondly, higher taxes on the wealthy. Taxes on the wealthy were increased significantly. They remained high during and through the golden period of the American economy after World War II into the 50s and early 60s. Much, much higher than they are today. They've been consistently lowered since the 1980s. But most importantly, and this is actually very little known, FDR's public works programs are very famous, but what are totally forgotten is that some of the New Deal programs actually made a lot of money for the country and increased employment, and that these offset the cost of setting up the more remembered work programs. Right? Now, so you'll see here in parentheses at the bottom that you will research the works program separately. That is an activity I originally asked you to engage in with a partner. That was with third period, with fifth period on the Friday, knowing that we were going to be out for a long time. I asked you guys to undertake this separately. And so that is the main way you guys are going to cover the works programs. So here, for a moment, I would like to talk about the lesser known partnerships between the private and public sector that FDR began. So here we have one of these little known initiatives, partnerships between the FDR administration and the private sector. And it revolves the housing industry. So how did FDR spur recovery in the housing industry? As you will know from your reading and from the Great Depression slideshow and lectures, that foreclosures on farms and towns had increased. We know the banks had collapsed. The remaining banks that were left, actually many of them had a lot of money. They had a lot of funds, but they were very, very nervous about lending the money, as you can understand. Would you lend money if you did not believe that you might get it back, that there was a risk involved. And so what we have here is an initiative by the government to get the banks to lend money. It's called the Federal Housing Administration. And essentially what this was that FDR insured the banks against losses. Thereby, if banks lent to people and those individuals failed to repay their loans, the federal government was on the hook for those loans, not the banks. And therefore, by doing this, this gave encouragement to banks, trust the banks, of course, to lend money. We also have an association with this, the invention of the long-term mortgage. Now, many of your parents will have longer-term mortgages. We're talking here, in these days, 15, 20 years. These were unheard of. This is an invention of the administration. It's worth thinking, too, that, about this, that FDR New Dealism largely fits into the framework of democratic socialism. But what we have here within the framework of democratic socialism, not a phrase that FDR liked to use, we have a cooperation between capitalism and government. So that's worth bearing in mind. Very, very successful program. Getting people houses, getting the economy moving again, helping the banks, and getting revenue for the federal government. So yes, again, little known, but it's a win-win-win here. Let's move on now to other initiatives. So other public-private partnerships. We have the Rural Electrification Administration. Rural Electrification Administration. Now, as you know, by the late 1920s, electricity had come to all of America's cities and towns, but in many areas in the countryside were lagging way behind, did not have electricity. In many countries, they did not have electricity until later still. My own parents are staying here with me at the moment, and my father tells me stories that he remembers electricity coming to his hometown, his home in the west of Ireland, rural west of Ireland, in the 1950s. So that's worth bearing in mind. And of course, without electricity, there was none of the modern conveniences in the countryside, no refrigerators. You couldn't stay up late reading. There wasn't any other of those like toasters or washing machines or any of these new conveniences. So what we have here is, again, a partnership. We have support for cooperatives, local cooperatives that are designed to bring electricity to the people, getting support by the government. Hugely successful. And again, then, during World War II, a little bit later, of course, how to get the country ready, how to get the country on a war footing. Well, we have here collaboration. The Defense Plant Corporation, collaboration, coordination, and support for major companies like General Motors, Ford, Boeing, and so forth to make armaments, munitions, war material for the war against the fascists and the Japanese aggressors. Now, you will also recall from the video, and hopefully you all got to watch that. If not, I'm sure you could find these clips online. FDR is known for being a great communicator and for his fireside chats. How did this help him and the nation? Well, this relates, of course, to the second of the possible DBQ prompts. And this idea of a changing relationship between the federal government and the American people. We saw this beginning to change under Teddy Roosevelt and, of course, Woodrow Wilson as well. But FDR really brings this to a new level. How so? FDR was not the first president to broadcast on radio. Calvin Coolidge was actually the first man. Calvin Coolidge, his nickname was Silent Cal. I suppose Coolidge was a bit of a poster boy for minimalists in the 20th century, Republicans who like a smaller government. But Coolidge also had another side to him. He was quite adept at using the radio, and he used it reasonably effectively, if in a small scale manner. His successor, Herbert Hoover, the much maligned, the very unfortunate Herbert Hoover, did not like using the radio and pretty much ignored it for the most part. FDR did not. He made great use of it in his direct communications to the American people, known as the fireside chats. Again, I hope that you watched the Roosevelt's documentary. You could find a clip of FDR's first fireside chat anywhere online, talking about the banking crisis, appealing to people to relodge their money in the banks in order to stimulate the flow of commercial activity. And this was greatly successful. He had an appealing voice. He came across as um, one's favorite uncle, as they said in the documentary, an approachable person. So as a result, people felt they knew FDR. And it did work. It did work. So in doing this, he transformed the office of the presidency, building on these changes that were initiated by TR and Wilson. And so we have an expansion of the federal government. There is now, this is the beginning of a greater collaboration between the federal government and therefore state governments also and the American people. The huge amount of mail that FDR and his wife Eleanor received on a daily basis was covered in the documentary. But also to touch upon here that we also now have the president as a legislative leader. Very important point. We've seen a little bit of this before. We've seen a little bit. Jackson was the first to do a little bit of this. Lincoln in the time of war, and the government shrinks again. Then Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, but now we really have Teddy Roosevelt is the one setting the legislative agenda, and stimulating huge amounts of activity. Of course, the question is, how is he able to get all this legislation passed? And there I think I will leave it for this lecture session. I'm going to divide my New Deal lecture into 3 parts. And the next part, I will start with a discussion of how FDR managed to get legislation passed. But we will also then begin into some of the difficulties. Not everything this man did was successful. He's a politician, not a saint, just like Lincoln, just like Washington. These men made mistakes. Not everything went according to plan, and there was some opposition, considerable opposition. So we'll deal with all of that in the next lecture. You will see posted on Classroom an opportunity an expectation on my behalf for you to respond to questions in chat room. Thank you.